everything that you need to have in terms of barriers to access to the rooms. You have to have perimeter security in place for any of your licensed areas. You have to have video surveillance coverage for all of those areas. There is odor control for your building that's required as part of the security elements of your building. There is supervision required in any of the rooms where cannabis is being worked with. And that'll tie into the security clearances in a minute. It also references the security directive. The security directive is an older piece of regulation that deals with storage of controlled substances. So this is where you get, when you hear about vaults and safes, that's coming from the security directive. And so that's got a higher level of security access that's required in order to be able to store large quantities of cannabis. And then finally, security clearances, which has come up a number of times as a topic. I know there's a lot of questions around it. Security clearances are one of the key things that are required to A, own a licensed producer, and B, to be one of the people who can supervise, as we listed above, for the rooms where cannabis is taking place. So in a licensed producer, nobody can access a room with cannabis unless somebody with security clearances coming into the room with them. And these security clearances are the ones that you've probably heard about, where it's a lengthy process through Health Canada. It requires coordination between them and the RCMP, and this is where they're doing the background checks that we've been talking about earlier today. So that one's an important slide, remember it, because we're going to cover it a little bit when we talk post-legalization. The other key element, and this is where my other quality assurance associates throughout the other licensed producers and I focus a lot of our attention, is good production practices. So good production practices is covered under subsection D. This is the section that is short in the regulations and very long in the actual application. So this is the section that requires you to have all of the controls in place around your production. So dealing with prevention of contamination, both contamination from exterior sources and cross-contamination internally in the building. So no cross-contamination of strains or different THC levels or active levels. Controlled processes, so there's an old adage, it exists in pharmaceuticals and applies here, is if it's not written down, it never happened, and do what you say, write what you do. And that's all around SOPs. So making sure that you have written documentation that outlines exactly what your procedures are. Those procedures need to be signed off and followed and only changed through a controlled process. So that's all spelled out in about one sentence in the regulations, but the application of it is fairly complex and requires a lot of effort to maintain. The sanitation programs are laid out in there. It's a very involved sanitation process. It's not just a matter of making sure that your building is clean. It involves changeover cleanings, making sure that even previous batches of cannabis that are worked with are entirely cleaned up from and removed from the room before new batches are brought in. It involves making sure that the cleaners that are used are appropriate for use, that you have documentation that proves that they're appropriate for their use, and that all is part of what is audited, as Sebastian was talking about earlier. That's all part of what's audited when Health Canada comes to visit. And lastly, equipment and premises are in good repair. I like to refer to this for my pharmaceutical clients as the no duct tape rule. You should not be repairing your equipment or your facility with duct tape. Equipment should be operating within the parameters that it was intended to operate within at the time that you purchased it. So it takes a little bit of preventative maintenance to keep your equipment in that kind of repair, which is part of what adds to the complexity of a GPP program. And then for those of you who are familiar with the pharmaceutical rules, this is very similar to what you would hear about in good manufacturing practices. One of the key differences just being that we don't, in cannabis production, have a requirement for process validation. So if you're familiar with that term, then you know that that's not expected in this system. Testing, we've talked a fair bit about that already. So we know that with testing, which comes from the ACMPR Section 69, there is testing that is required, but there's no specific testing that's laid out by Health Canada. So this is, as you heard my colleagues talking about earlier, where we spend a fair bit of time as an organization trying to figure out what testing is the best and most appropriate for ensuring the health and safety of our consumers. But we do have some guidance documents. So we work with what are called Schedule B publications, so things like the United States Pharmacopoeia or the European Pharmacopoeia, to make sure that we're testing them according to an appropriate monograph, so something like herbal medicines, which lays out a number of the contaminants that we talked about before, like microbial contamination, whether that's bacteria or mold, or certain particular pathogens like E. coli or Salmonella, heavy metals, aflatoxins, and then other contaminants as might be appropriate to your process. So that's all included in there. For testing, and this is specifically laid out in the ACMPR, validation is required for your testing methods. So it takes a little bit of extra effort to be able to go through your testing regime and prove that you can get reproducible results in your testing, but that's one of the requirements from the ACMPR. Lastly, distribution, and you can imagine that this topic is going to come up fairly heavily when I come back to the post-legalization piece. Currently, the only legal distribution system in Canada is mail order direct to clients from a licensed producer. So a license or a client with a medical document, so medically gated, that's the only person who can register right now, somebody from a physician, or just recently, nurse practitioners in Ontario. They have now been granted the right to also sign cannabis medical documents. They use those to register with a licensed producer, and then the licensed producer will ship mail order through Canada Post directly to their door, obviously with some security requirements in place about exactly what that is. But that is currently the only distribution system that exists. We're going to see some changes to that as we come through to this next part. Lastly, for clients and their possession, so again, possession is limited to medically authorized clients. Only those clients who are registered with a licensed producer currently are allowed to have possession of cannabis. There are a few limited exceptions to that, so for those of you who have heard of things like responsible individuals, these are for cases where a patient, due to their medical needs, may not be able to actually procure and administer the cannabis themselves. They can assign responsible individuals to be able to do that for them, and there's exceptions in the way the regulations are written to allow that person to have possession of cannabis, as well as some medical practitioners and hospital workers. There's some exceptions in there for them, but effectively medically gated possession. And they're limited to a maximum of 150 grams, but that ultimately it's limited by your medical document amount. So if you're allowed 30 times your medically authorized amount in your possession at any one time. So if you've got a gram a day, you're allowed 30 grams. And you'll see that gram a day, 30 grams type relationship come up when we get to the post-legalization section. So effectively, what I just talked through, this is our current system. We have a large kind of fairly vertically integrated system of production all the way through to finished product packaging and testing at the licensed producers with a sole medical distribution system that's based on client registrations with medical gating. So you've kind of got this single stream right now, and that's all vertically integrated in single companies. So let's talk a little bit about the post-legalization. So this is the section that Eric Costin covered a lot of this morning, but I want to go through some of those same types of details with you about what this is going to look like as early as July 1st next year. So you've already heard from this morning, we know that we're taking a look at the recently introduced Cannabis Act. I really like calling it the Act Respecting Cannabis and to Amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code and other acts, because it sounds long and boring, and that's my way. But it's Bill C-45, and one thing I would like to make sure everyone understands as we go through this next section, a lot of this was taken from the Act as we saw it introduced on April 13th. A lot can change between now and when an Act is published, so some of this is by nature going to be speculation because we don't know what's going to change. Also, some of it is going to be a bit of speculation because an act is not meant to have the level of detail that a regulation is going to have. So there's going to be a lot that's going to come out in the next year or so, both with federal and provincial regulations that could give us details that we don't know right now. But I'll try and speak specifically to where I'm making an educated guess versus where we know something is in an act. So, production. We know from what we've seen already from the Act that production is going to remain with federally licensed producers. So in the short term, that likely means the existing licensed producers. It's not clear currently whether there's going to be a separate stream of applications for producers wanting to produce into a recreational market or a medical market. We're going to address a little bit of that towards the end, but it is possible that we're going to be looking at the same authorization screen. Make a note of it and I'll come back to you at the end. The government website has already listed separate applications.
It says that when the note was sent, separate record. I don't know, they may change that.
Okay. Okay, well, so, and this is why it's good to have audience interaction. So, we were just saying that it sounds like there will potentially be a separate stream. But what it comes down to, in terms of some of those details I went through before, we are expecting them to have a lot of the same requirements for federal production in both the medical and the recreational system. So we're talking about security and clearance. They've talked significantly about wanting to control any potential diversion to the black market. This is something that when the minister spoke about the release, they were very focused on that. So we anticipate that there's going to be significant security requirements. So that same list of security requirements I went through earlier for current licensed producers, that's probably the type of level we should be thinking about when we're talking about recreational production. Now, there may be some slight reductions in the levels of those, but those are the elements you should be thinking of. Do I have camera coverage? Do I have perimeter coverage? Do I have internal security? It sounds, at least initially, like a security clearance of some sort is going to be something that they're going to be considering. Not clear. It's not clear what the current process for security clearance is. That's kind of a behind doors thing. So that may change a little bit, but that's also something that we're expecting to see with requirements for licensed producers, is some measure of security clearance in order to get that license. GPPs, that's likely going to remain. All of the types of things that we need to watch for to show that we have controlled processes during production, likely to remain in a recreational market. And this isn't significantly different than what you might see in food production. Especially controlled food production. So there's special classes of controlled food like dairy or things like that, where you are still going to have controlled processes, and you're going to have to demonstrate for auditors that you're meeting those controlled processes through documentation for your batches. So again, maybe a slight reduction in the level to which that's expected, but you should be thinking along the lines of GPPs for a production facility. Final packaging, so I know that was a question that had come up a number of times when I was speaking with people about whether final packaging would likely occur at the provincial distribution level. Not clear from what I had seen laid out in the Act, but final packaging is a GPP controlled step. It's a step where there's potential cross-contamination and you need to have a certain amount of batch recording available and packaging component documentation available. So it's likely that that's going to remain with something where they need to see or have GPP control. So most likely that will remain at a federally licensed producer level. Now that may not stay. Over time we may look more to a model where there's bulk sales available to provincial distributors, but at least initially it's unlikely that that's going to go away. So we're probably looking at final packaged product sales into its distribution channel. Testing, also something that given everything that we've heard from the government about their desire for making sure that there's controlled quality, we're still going to see requirements for testing, and it's unlikely that these controls are going to be significantly different than what we currently have. The one thing that may change, that may make a lot of sense, is potentially micro levels. So you've probably heard a lot of discussion around appropriate micro counts. For a medical product and for a general consumption product, those can potentially be two fairly different things. For example, with foods, depending on the type of food, particularly a dry food, those can be fairly high. Maybe not something you want to think about right after lunch, but micro counts can sometimes be higher than what you would expect. In a medical market, lower micro counts are far more important because you potentially have immune-compromised patients as part of your client base, or you likely have those as part of your client base. So there may be changes in some of the limits, but we're still expecting to see contamination testing as part of the requirements for release. You're probably getting a sense already. I'm going through a lot of the same, a lot of the same, a lot of the same. So far, that sounds like what it's going to be at the production level. Home growing. Home growing is a little bit different because now we're talking about a system where home growing is permitted outside of a medically gated system. So home growing is going to be permitted, as Eric was talking to earlier today, 4 plants per residence, 1 meter in height, and the intention, of course, is that it's not for distribution. So from what I read in the Q&As, this is not going to be a system where you can amalgamate, so you can't say, well, 8 of me and my buddies all live here, so we're going to be growing 32 plants. It sounds like 4 plants per residence, and with the limitation on height, that's part of controlling to make sure that the quantities that are being produced are not going to be appropriate for distribution. The distribution that we have heard about so far. So this is covered under the new Cannabis Act, Section 69, assuming it stays that way, basically pushes it to provincial and territorial licensing. So effectively at this point what we know is that the federal government has said there needs to be a distribution system, provinces need to set one up. So there's a lot of fairly wide open options here. One of the main kind of questions that comes up repeatedly is whether or not this is going to be something that, although it's provincially licensed, is it going to be provincially controlled? And there's nothing in the federal legislation right now that is locking that in. They're trying intentionally to leave that open to the governments, the provincial and territorial governments to set up what works for them. So that's going to allow either a board-controlled, like a provincial board-controlled system, a private system, or some blend of those two. And that can be licensed any way they want. And there's also lots of options there, whether that's going to be for storefronts, where you go in and purchase directly from a storefront a particular strain, or other types of distribution systems are still potentially allowed. So maybe we're looking at mail order systems that exist within a province, similar to the mail order system that exists right now. They may continue to allow federally licensed producers to mail order into a particular province. It'll all depend on how the provinces want to set that up, but there's lots of kind of wide open options right now for the provincial and territorial governments to set that up as they need. There are a couple of stipulations that the federal government has put in the Act, particularly must be purchased from a federally licensed producer. So this is part of cementing the federal control over the production. As well, there's other elements in there around kind of baseline security requirements that I suspect will be fleshed out far more in federal regulations. So there's more to go there. Provincially, they may require more than what's laid out federally, but federally they would set a minimum standard for those security requirements. So possibly going to need to consider the same types of things that we talked about with licensed producers. Do you have perimeter security? Do you have video surveillance? Possibly provinces may be requiring some form of security clearance as well. It wouldn't be surprising if they were. The key details about what they're going to require for that security clearance is going to be pretty important in the next few months. Also, there's an element in there for transitional direct sales. So what the federal government has said is that for anybody who, for any province that doesn't implement a retail sales regulation framework, the existing LP sales will remain for that province. So the existing licensed producers will be permitted federally to sell into a province if that province doesn't set something up. Key difference being those federally licensed producers would be allowed to apply for an amendment to their license that allows them to sell to recreational patients, obviously. because this is the post-legalization system. So it wouldn't be necessarily part of the same stream, but it would be coming through the same sales channels. Home growing, I went backward. There we go. So clients in possession, also something that changes significantly. This is no longer medically gated in a post-legalization system. So now all of us are permitted to have 30 grams of cannabis so long as we're over the age of 18, or possibly higher ages in individual provinces if those provinces choose to change those. And sharing is permitted, which is not something that's currently permitted in the medical system. So I believe they've said 30 grams sharing is also permitted. Not entirely clear to me how they track that. Like, can they get 30 grams here and then 2 minutes later the same? I'm not sure. Doesn't really matter, it hasn't fleshed out in the regulations, but sharing will be permitted, which is not something we currently have. Distribution in at-home quantities, there is going to need to be some sort of regulation brought in about what those quantities can be. Obviously, it will need to be significantly greater than 30 grams when you're producing at home, because your harvest will be coming up at a time where you're not taking 30 grams off of your plants a day as you go. There's going to be some stipulations in there for that, but the main difference will be possession is no longer going to be medically gated, and it is going to be at about that 30 gram limit, which, as we were talking earlier, in the current system equates to a gram a day type of situation. So, medical use. What happens post-legalization with the medical use system? As Eric was talking about earlier today, we retain the current system, at least currently. So all of the existing licensed producers who are right now selling through the direct sales model, through mail order direct to clients, that will remain in effect for medical sales. Still going to be medically gated, still going to require a medical document from a licensed practitioner or a nurse practitioner in Ontario, and no changes to that. Long term, really hard to know what's going to happen with that. I suspect, and I know a couple of people have spoken to this to some extent, that we are going to need to retain some sort of medical system for patients who are obtaining this through their doctor to treat various symptoms, where you need to be able to have a clear reason for tax differentiation. So being able to submit to say, for your taxes, I am purchasing this for medical purposes, it's very difficult to trace that out unless you have some sort of medical system. Doesn't mean it's necessarily going to resemble the system we currently have, but I would expect to see some form of medical sales to continue. So effectively what we have now is the exact same thing. Let's see if this actually works. Oh, it does. The same system that we actually saw before, but we've tacked on this secondary piece where we're actually able to sell through to recreational clients. You've got the same client registration base. It's just not and that was the end of the, okay. Well, you saw it down at the bottom. You've still got the same client base. We're expecting that client base to be much, much larger, and there's a talk coming up later this afternoon around the business opportunities associated with that. But key to that business opportunity kind of piece is, down at the bottom there, we now have the provincially licensed distributors. And that's currently not a thing that exists in our systems. So in terms of emerging possibilities in a post-legalization market, that's one of the key pieces that we're trying to look at. What relationship those provincially licensed distributors have to licensed producers is something that we need to develop over the next few months. So a couple of other things just for consideration. The testing requirements of recreational and medical, I kind of touched on that already. That's one of those key differences for microcontamination. Testing at point of distribution is going to be something that is, at least for me, of interest. Whether or not there's going to be some additional testing that's going to be put upon provincially licensed distributors, that they've got some guarantee that the transactions that are occurring with the licensed producers are according to their expectations. This will be different from province to province, as each province sets up whatever level of control they feel most appropriate there. Lastly, edibles and local health authorities. So, as we've heard from both from Eric this morning and from a number of other speakers, the edibles question is huge and it's very unclear. We know that system doesn't have any of our current, the current act doesn't list anything about the edibles, but we know that it's going to be something that is going to be demanded in the marketplace. And we're going to have to see how the provinces are going to roll this out, given the fact that it aligns with food manufacturing. Food manufacturing is a huge question, not a question, it's a huge industry that is currently completely separate from cannabis as an industry. Local health authorities, you know, the same authorities that are involved with licensing restaurants, also license food manufacturers, and they inspect them. And that's probably the type of system that they're going to need to be integrating with a cannabis system in order to start producing edibles. So it's probably a long time coming. It's very complicated, and I can understand why they're taking their extra time in figuring that out. So I apologize if that was really quick. I have Colette coming, so I'm not sure if that's because I'm getting dragged off or if we want to do questions. Do we have time? Oh, well.
Thank you very much, Chris. So yes, Chris is willing to answer a few questions if there are some questions.
You're welcome to use the mic. Sorry, you're welcome to use the mic, or if you want, I'll just repeat your question if you want to call it out.
Yeah, there's been a couple of things that were brought up earlier this morning, and you did as well, on with respect to direct distribution, and that the province is going to override that. Do you see that actually happening, or do you think some provinces will allow us as producers to be able to directly sell to consumers and mail, as you were doing today in the medical market?
Yeah, great question. And I suspect some provinces will. I know certainly the position of the CCA is to allow as much consumer option as possible. And so our hope is that within those consumer options, there may be storefronts. Some of those storefronts will be private, some of those storefronts will be provincially controlled, and there may be options for direct sales, and that may include direct sales from LPs into the province. And so yeah, absolutely, our hope is that at least some, if not all of the provinces allow some of that to continue. Yeah, it's a great option for a lot of consumers.
Do you know how that maps onto, how all this maps onto like what the United States, well, the 8 states are doing?
Sure, so when you say maps on, you mean does it, how closely it resembles it more than anything? You know, I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not the best person to speak to the states and what they've been doing there. I know that that's been very influential in considerations that the task force brought in, and that the task force recommendations were a key part of what this act looks like. So I suspect that it informed it a lot. The informing, I know, came from both the failures and successes, so it doesn't necessarily mean that just because it informed it, that it copied it, because there was a lot of learning that I know we were able to do from that. But no, ultimately, to be perfectly honest, I'm not the best person to answer it. I know there's a number of people here who probably know a fair bit more about that, and if during our kind of, what did you call it, we're going to all join each other for the networking. Yes, I knew there was a word for it. See, I'm not a business guy, can you tell? For the networking portion, it'd be great to kind of find some people, and I'm sure some can answer that.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. Just wondering, do you have any sense of when the application for recreational licensing will be available to new producers? And prior to July 2018, do you foresee any kind of special, here I am looking for my words, but any kind of concessions for those new producers to start setting up their shop, to start producing in expectation of that new regulated market?
Right, great question. And I think Eric, if I recall, touched on it a little bit this morning. Effectively, the way that those application processes are going to work is that Health Canada won't be able to take those applications until the regulations exist saying that those applications are a thing. So effectively, those regs will need to be in place, which should be no later than July 1st, 2018, before those applications can start. And that's going to be true both for licensed producers and for any new entrants into the system. Do we have good time? All right, last question.
Can current applications be amended to include what we just talked about in that previous question?
Yeah, okay, excellent question. So, sorry for those of you who just missed the beginning part of that. Can current applications be amended to include that? So, I don't think we have the details on that. If I were to hazard a guess, fair warning, this is a guess, I would expect, yes, that will certainly be an option. I know that we've had an indication that licensed producers who currently have their license can amend that license in order to be able to sell recreationally. And I believe there was a system whereby when oils were introduced to part of the selling regime in August, applicants whose applications were already in, they were able to amend those applications in progress. Now, there are obviously submissions that are required to do that, to be able to demonstrate that you need to be able to meet X, Y, and Z, whatever that is laid out in the regulations for recreational sales. But if you've already made an application for a medical sales license, that's likely going to be the higher of the two requirements. So most likely, there's not going to be a lot extra that would need to be done. So my guess would be, yes, there'll be a method for doing that.